so that we can replay it for our friends who aren't watching on Facebook. So first off, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today, both those who are watching and most importantly, those who are participating. So I'm going to introduce our group here, our virtual panel in this era of quarantine. This is how we do education and advocacy these days. So first we have Maggie Hirchala, who is a Martin County Commissioner for 20 years. She's served on a number of governor's commissions on the Everglades, water, and planning. And she's a member of the Everglades Coalition Hall of Fame. Welcome, Maggie.
Thank you.
And we have Dr. Gary Goforth. He's a Stewart-based environmental engineer with more than 35 years of experience in water resources engineering, especially big projects like Everglades, Lake Okeechobee, and Kissimmee restoration projects. So welcome, Gary. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And Rayanne Wessel is a marine scientist and limnologist with 4 decades of experience. For the past 12 years, she's served on as the Natural Resource Policy Director for the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. Welcome, Rayanne.
Thank you.
So this is the first time we've done this, and we're going to hope that we don't have any technical glitches, but if we do, that's okay. We're going to roll with the punches. I'm Eve Samples from Friends of the Everglades. I'm the executive director of Friends, which was founded in 1969 by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And as it happens, that was the year before the first Earth Day, which we celebrated the 50th anniversary of yesterday. So it feels very fitting to be with you all today. As I mentioned, this is our first virtual clean water conversation. We decided to do this because under normal circumstances, when there's not a pandemic going on in the world, we'd be out there meeting with people, talking to them about Lake Okeechobee, inviting folks like you in to inform them, and then springing into action when important events come up and policymakers are making decisions. Well, we have to do that virtually these days, so this clean water conversation is a stab at that. And we invite anyone watching on Facebook right now to submit comments or questions right in the comments below, and we'll relay those to our panelists as we move through here. So first, let's talk a little bit about why we're here, and then I'm going to kick it to my panelists here with some questions. But really, the big topic of conversation is Lake Okeechobee and the management plan that is being completely overhauled in terms of how water moves in and out of it. Lake Okeechobee is the liquid heart of Florida. It affects the health of the Everglades. It affects the health of the northern estuaries, the St. Lucie to the east, the Caloosahatchee to the west. Of course, it affects the health of the Everglades because it used to slowly flow and be filtered down through the river of grass to the Everglades. And it affects the health of a third estuary, Florida Bay, which right now is suffering from really salty conditions. And we'll get into that a little bit later. The Army Corps of Engineers plays a huge role in how water moves in and out of Lake Okeechobee. And since 2008, the lake has been managed under something called LORS, the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule. That was devised after Hurricane Katrina. And as you might imagine, back then, the Army Corps was very sensitive to any breaches of levees or dams. And what wasn't top of mind at that time was damage to the estuaries and the toxic algae blooms that we've seen in the decades since then, which have been really devastating. And we're learning much more about the direct link between those algae blooms and health concerns among people who live on the coast or anyone who comes into contact with them. So the good news is there is a new lake plan that's being reworked right now. It's called LOSM, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, and the public gets a say in what this looks like. So this group here knows a lot about how that's going to affect the estuaries, how that can affect human health. And next week, there's a really important meeting. It's a LOSM project delivery team meeting on April 30th, and the public's invited to attend virtually. We'll post the link in the chat. And we want to give you guys the information you need to weigh in an informed way. So with all of that said, we're going to start out by talking a little bit about what the current conditions look like right now. And that's okay, Rayanne's phone is ringing. Like I said, we're going to roll with the punches here. And the current lake level is 11.37 feet. That's pretty low for Lake Okeechobee. It's been good for the St. Lucie River. So for the Caloosahatchee, which I know Rayanne's going to talk about. But let's talk about what you're seeing out there. Maggie, I know you're an avid paddler and you were out there paddling this morning. So what have these low lake conditions meant for the St. Lucie River this year?
It means they're not dumping on us from the lake, and any dumping of water, even when it's not full of blue-green algae that's toxic, is destructive of the grass beds and sort of the very basis of the St. Lucie. So what we're seeing out there now is mullet jumping. The inlet is full of terns and pelicans, all diving at something that's swimming down underneath. The water's looking sparkling clean, and it's come back. It hasn't come all the way back, but it's looking good.
Stand by. I'm getting a message that we need to restart the live stream. Darn it. Okay.
That's all right. We can do that.
Let's do that now. Sorry, guys. Okay, cut out. I'm going to share the page image, Friends of the Everglades. Okay, we're going to do take 2, clean water conversation. All right, not just you, Maggie. Okay, I think we are live again now, and we were just talking about the conditions out on the St. Lucie River with Maggie. And Maggie, tell us a little bit about what it looks like out there now that we've been given a reprieve from Lake Okeechobee discharges to the east, at least, for almost 2 years now.
It looks gorgeous out there. The mullet are jumping, the grass beds are coming back, the hermit crabs are coming back. The estuary has a fantastic ability to try to recover. And it's had a little time now. It's looking a lot better.
Eve, if I could add, Maggie touched on the seagrass beds. That is so vital for the health of our organisms in the estuary. Everything from conchs that we're now seeing, the young conchs are coming back. The seagrass beds serve as nursery for fish, and so by having a healthy seagrass population, it really helps our fishes as well as other organisms that thrive on the seagrasses. And as Maggie said, estuaries have in general a good resiliency. However, we're very concerned. The St. Lucie has been receiving these discharges since 1923, and anecdotal information suggests that the estuary's resiliency is actually decreasing over time. Even though let's go back, say, mid-1970s, by that time the estuary had already been getting 40 years, 50 years of discharges, but there was a healthy seagrass population during these periods of no lake discharges. However, it appears that resiliency is being lost in the estuary as these heavy dumping of sediment, nutrients, and algae, the toxic algae, that the seagrass is just simply not recovering as quickly or as comprehensive as it used to be. So we're still concerned. We're absolutely elated with the conditions out there now. We're right in the middle of oyster spawning season, and so we've got nice clean water. So the conditions are excellent. This is what we'd like to see every year.
That's a good point, Gary, and maybe our expectations have been calibrated down over the decades because we've been blasted so often. We all get excited when the water's semi-clear and isn't toxic algae green. So good point. Better now, but maybe some diminishing returns. So,
Right.
Rayanne, you're on the West Coast. The three of us are on the East Coast. Tell us what the Caloosahatchee is looking like right now, because it's a different situation, I know, than the St. Lucie River, its relationship with Lake Okeechobee.
Right. So the Caloosahatchee had a historic connection to the Western Everglades, came out of Lake Okeechobee when the lake was at its highest levels. And a little bit of that water flowed through a Western Everglades type system and a series of lakes before it hit the waterfall that it fed into the Caloosahatchee River. Today, though, with dredging and locks and dams, we have a 75-mile long river, about 33 miles of which is an estuary, but the rest is a freshwater impoundment between two locks and dams. Our estuary, as a result, has very different conditions from the downstream end by the Sanibel and San Carlos Bay, Shell Point, where the tidal influence has some pretty clear water right now, and it looks lovely. But upstream is where we start to have the problems. It gets too salty, and in an estuary, you need a balance of an envelope, we like to call it, of fresh water sitting on top of salt water, and that wedge moves up and down the estuary over the season to mix the salinity a little bit saltier, a little bit fresher, depending on where you are. If you lose any part of that, let's say the freshwater lens, you can lose a whole habitat that is a key nursery for fish, crabs, blue crabs, shrimp, and the habitat is critically designated federally for the endangered small-tooth sawfish and manatee. So we depend today on Lake Okeechobee for dry season flows, unlike the St. Lucie, which wants none. But we've got this balancing act. We're also the largest discharge point when there's excess water from the lake. 70 to 80% of that will be directed to the Caloosahatchee estuary. And then it blows that estuary nursery out to the Gulf, where you lose all year classes of fisheries. So it's a balancing act, but we have very good ideas about where we need to be to establish healthy thresholds. So right now, we got some clear water down by the beaches, but we do have too high of salinity in that low salinity freshwater zone in the upper estuary. We need more water.
Okay, bear with me 1 second. We had a little bit of breakup again, but we are working on it right now. Okay. And Rand, I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on what that looks like? If you're out there paddling, like Maggie was this morning, and you're in the Caloosahatchee, what does that hypersalinity or too salty condition actually look like from the surface?
From the surface paddling, you wouldn't notice it unless you splashed your face and you expected to be in some fresh water and you had some salty water. You wouldn't necessarily see that. What we are starting to see upstream of the locks is some toxic blue-green algae just starting to appear. I wouldn't call it a bloom yet, but the appearance is there, and that is caused by the stagnation. When water supplies, freshwater flows get cut back, the water stagnates behind the lock, and because there's no fresh water coming in and mixing it, all the nutrients in that water with the long day length and the warm temperatures starts to bloom some algae. So we're starting to see that, but on the estuary side, not so much. You wouldn't. That's the insidious part about it, is you can say that we need water, but people on the coast think that it looks really great. The problem is what you don't see are the fishery fry, the next generation of fisheries that get impacted.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for that. And for those of you watching live, sorry for the in and out a little bit. We mentioned this is our first clean water conversation, but we're back live now and continuing to talk about Lake Okeechobee's Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual and how you can weigh in on future management of Lake Okeechobee. So we're talking about current conditions, and we've talked about how the St. Lucie is looking better. The Caloosahatchee is struggling with a bit of a Goldilocks effect of getting too little fresh water right now. And now let's talk about Lake Okeechobee itself. Gary, I was hoping you'd give us a picture of what the lake looks like. It's been a dry spring for the most part. The recent storms we've had this week notwithstanding. What happens to the lake when it drops below 11 feet or close to 11 feet?
Well, this time of year, it's actually very healthy for the lake with respect to the growth of submerged aquatic vegetation. Water levels are low enough that light can penetrate to the bottom, particularly along the western edges. The littoral marsh is quite extensive, and so we're seeing a tremendous regrowth of submerged aquatic vegetation, particularly over the last couple of years. Prior to that, as lake levels were a little bit higher, the light was not penetrating to the bottom. There's a loss of seagrass, and just like in a estuarine system, the seagrasses are a foundation for the health of the organisms within the lake itself. So the lake, in terms of submerged aquatic vegetation, looks good. You know, there are some downsides of low lake levels. The endangered Everglades snail kite likes a little bit higher levels with respect to this time of year for nesting purposes, and they forage on snails that aren't utilizing the lake. So, but again, every few years, it's overall good for the lake to see these low levels. It's hard to say, you know, 1 out of every 5 years or 2 out of every 5 years, you know, but I think that the key is some variability. And so this is going to be, I think, another good year. The the submerged aquatic vegetation, the metric that the Corps of Engineers and the Water Management District would like to see is something on the order, I think it's about 40,000 acres, 20 to 40,000 acres of submerged aquatic vegetation. I think right now we're about half that, upwards of 8 to 10,000. So it's good that there's been 2 years in a row to give the SAV opportunity to grow. And I think that'll help the long-term ability of the lake to stay resilient to fluctuating water levels. So the lake is looking good. It's bass spawning time, so good fishing going on out there where particularly in the seagrass there, the grass beds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah, Maggie.
Yeah, adding on what Gary's saying, the submerged aquatic vegetation, sorry if we call it SAVs sometimes, is the stuff that comes a long way from the bottom and grows up to the top. When you have high water like you did in Irma and like they did in the lake management the year following that, you kill that stuff and its roots die and it's die. And the really important part of that, totally apart from the environmental health of the lake, is there is no toxic blue-green algae where you have 40,000 acres of submerged aquatic vegetation. It can't compete with the natural vegetation if you give it that drawdown so it can grow back. So if we don't grow back, if we don't have some low periods like last year and this year to let those submerged aquatics grow back, we're going to have more blue-green algae, we're going to have more intense blooms, and we're going to have a much wider surface area of the lake that's covered it. And that's something that doesn't just affect us on the estuaries. It affects the children who live south of the lake. It affects the people who depend on it for water supply. It affects all of us.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are a lot of competing interests when it comes to Lake Okeechobee. Of course, we have the estuaries, which I think St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee are pretty well aligned, even though they have slightly different needs. And then there is a giant swath of agriculture south of the lake that essentially has used the lake as a reservoir over the years. And we're talking about the benefits of holding the lake low during the dry season because it's generally good for the estuaries as long as the Caloosahatchee gets what it needs. However, agriculture tends to like it held higher so that they can have their irrigation needs met. So let's talk about this Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, the new plan the Army Corps of Engineers is devising, and how it can be overhauled to ensure that we aren't moving toxic algae blooms out the estuaries, and we are moving what we need south down to the Everglades and Florida Bay. And of course, not leaving anyone with dire water shortages in our populated areas to the south. So Maggie, I'm going to kick that to you. I mean, explain this process and how we can balance the needs, if you will.
Well, first of all, I'd say to everybody out there, you don't have to remember what LOSUM stands for. Just talk about the lake schedule. The lake schedule is going to be vitally important for all of us. In the past, basically, though I don't think that the Corps intended for that to happen, LORS has ended up a disaster for the environment and very effective for a few large water users. Most of the water use went to agriculture directly south of the lake. And there was some concern about the dike, but there was little concern at all about dumping on either estuary. There was little concern at all about getting water down to Florida Bay, where the hypersalinity was causing algae blooms. There was little concern about Everglades National Park, or even for the biggest water user of all, which is Miami-Dade County. It depends on having fresh water in the Everglades west of their well field. So trying to balance those things, and to balance environment not just as something that's kind of nice if you don't need the water sort of thing. The lake's health is critical to every single user, including the water supply users. The lake's health and the ability to keep it not too high so you don't kill the vegetation, not too low so you don't kill the vegetation, to keep a balance there and to keep a healthy lake is something that can be done. How do you do it? Get in touch with some environmental organization that can tell you what the Corps website is that tells you how to comment. Believe it or not, the Corps of Engineers wants to hear from you. Honest. They really want to hear from you. And there is an army right now of sugar lobbyists that will be lobbying to keep Lake Okeechobee as full as possible so that sugar will never run out of water. Nobody wants to kill, well, probably some people do. Our intention is not to kill sugar. Our intention is not to hurt water users. Our intention is to have a system that works for everybody. And if everybody from the Florida Keys and Miami's water supply and Everglades National Park and all of us on either estuary and the people who care about the health of the lake get involved in making sure that the schedule the Corps works with recognizes all the problem. And they need to recognize that human health from cyanobacteria and that the environment itself, whether it's Caloosahatchee grass beds or the lake or Everglades National Park or Florida Bay, the environment is what makes that system work. If we ignore it by guaranteeing water supply, we kill the goose.
Thanks, Maggie. I want to remind folks that they can ask questions in the comments on our Facebook live stream. And before I ask Rayanne about what's at stake for the Caloosahatchee and the new lake management plan, I'm going to attempt to share my screen here so that we can talk about your images you sent me that shows. Can you guys see that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Rayanne, talk us through kind of the historic flow and what's at stake now for the Caloosahatchee, if you would.
Sure. So as you can see on the satellite image on the left and the graphic on the right, the historic system is still very much intact with the headwaters in Orlando at the north end of the system, making its way into Lake Okeechobee. That floodplain was up to 3 miles wide, and the water a drop of water that fell in Orlando would take 6 to 8 months to get to Lake Okeechobee because there was an Everglades-like braided system as opposed to a true river system that flowed south by gravity into the lake. The lake would expand across the landscape and contract given the wet or the dry season. Most of that water would flow south into the Everglades and down to Florida Bay. When the lake got particularly high across the landscape, some of that water would come to the Western Everglades, to an Everglades-like system that was between where we have LaBelle today and the lake. The point when everything changes, of course, is hurricane driven. By 1926 and 28, we've had a decade with 3 major storms, these 2 hurricanes and a flood, and the state was looking for help to contain the lake, to to manage the damage that was being done to people living in and around the lake. Once that lake dike was built, first a rudimentary one and then a more formal one, not highly engineered, but more formal, that cut off all the natural flow to the south. And so there had to be some way to get rid of water when the lake filled up and not blow out the dike. The majority of that water would come to the west, and the St. Lucie Canal was created to make another connection to the east. That wasn't still enough in the 1940s when the additional hurricanes affected the Kissimmee Valley. They realized that we needed something much more robust. And that's what created the federal-state partnership and the Comprehensive Everglades plan that started as a flood control plan. Frankly, no one was thinking about all the consequences to other things. We just wanted to control the flooding. And I think that brings us today is to a situation where the Caloosahatchee has been channelized, the St. Lucie has been connected, and the St. Lucie really doesn't have an organic need for water from the lake, but we have a residual and ever more present need for water from the lake, if only because the dredging that occurred in the Caloosahatchee corrupted natural springs that provided fresh water year-round to the much smaller estuary.
Somebody take that phone away. Yeah.
And so today we have a need for water from the lake in the dry season, but we get way too much in the wet season. I want to make a point about Loesome though, and how critical this is, because water is a public resource. And when we talk about who gets the water and why they get it, the Florida Model Water Code envisioned that you would first allocate water to natural systems. Whatever was left over would be divided up between permitted users. We did just the opposite. That hasn't occurred. And so where we find ourselves today is maybe a lot like the census. Loesome is going to divide up water. Who gets it? When do they get it? How much do they get? Just like the census is going to allocate representation and funding for communities. If we don't get this right with Loesome, basing numbers on science and resource needs, we are not going to allocate the public resource responsibly, and we're going to live with the consequences. So, and it could be another 12 or more years before that gets revisited. So I want to just give some underscore to the importance of this Loesome process and people's engagement.
That's a great metaphor, the census. And I know you've made the point that the Caloosahatchee has had its ration reduced of water from Lake Okeechobee during this dry period, but big users south of the lake, large farms, really haven't. Would you want to elaborate on that a little, Rayanne?
Sure, I'd love to. Right, what's been happening for some time now is that the Caloosahatchee is very easily cut off from flows because of the engineered system that we have. You have locks and dams, you can just cut off the flow. We have an agricultural dominated watershed upstream of the estuary that does have water needs, that they use water out of the river. But the estuary has water needs as well. Every week we do a report and we analyze where the water has gone, who's gotten it and where it's gone. And we've been cut back for so long that for 5 weeks we have had critically high salinities that are starting to impact and affect that western, the little tape grass that we have left. So to put some numbers to this, what we've been seeing is about 2/3 of the water is going to permitted water users. And while maybe a quarter might be delivered to the Caloosahatchee, only about 11% is making it to the estuary. And we have a shortfall of about 68%. Main point is the estuary, Mother Nature's nursery, the public's nursery for fisheries, is being cut back from a public resource while private interests are profiting by getting all they want. No one else is being restricted. Only the Caloosahatchee estuary is really being impacted at this point.
Thank you for elaborating on that. And of course, we all know, because we saw what happened to the estuaries in 2018, that there is a direct economic impact when our water is toxic and covered with blue-green algae. So we, of course, care about the economy. It's critical that Florida have a strong economy, and it will be increasingly critical moving forward after this pandemic. But it's not just about the economy south of the lake. So thank you for expanding on that. So Gary, we've talked a lot about the Army Corps of Engineers and its role in lake management. Who are the other major players that the public can engage with and who matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. Other than the Corps of Engineers, which manages its large control structures that go to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie, the South Florida Water Management District controls, in fact, they control the majority of structures that enter and leave from the lake. As part of the lake schedule, the LOSM, there will be guidelines provided to the Water Management District for how they release water in droughts as well as in periods of flood. And it's those higher levels, the regulatory releases, that pose the greatest harm to the St. Lucie estuary. Not only the economic impacts, but certainly the human health impacts. And so it's a very coordinated effort between the Water Management District and the Corps. If the Water Management District, in sending water south to their stormwater treatment areas and to the agricultural areas and other water supply users, if they can send that water during the dry season, then that helps lower the lake in advance of the upcoming wet season, which we're next month or so will be in that level. If, however, the Water Management District cannot send that water south due to, let's say, high rainfall conditions south of the lake, then the lake stage is going to rise, the water level is going to rise, and that brings the Corps of Engineers into the picture in terms of actually opening up the structures to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie during these high levels. So it very much is a coordinated effort. The Water Management District and the Corps have a good relationship. They're on the phone with each other multiple times during the week. It's been I think a good relationship, and they continually try to improve that with face-to-face meetings, Zoom these days. But the Water Management District moves a lot of water from the lake, and they're a very key player. So even though it's a federal process to develop a new lake regulation schedule, it very much involves stakeholders, the Water Management District, as well as municipalities and other governmental agencies are at the table. And this LOSM process, the process to develop the lake stage, it really is a lot of public involvement. The Corps does a good job of allowing public comment. You can send in emails, you can provide comments at the meetings themselves. And it's important, I think, that the public, understand and ask very simple questions. For example, I always like to ask about how will the lake operation affect human health? This time around, 12 years ago, when the current lake schedule was developed, we didn't really understand the health impacts of toxic blue-green algae. Now we have a tremendous store of information in terms of the effects of this toxin on human liver. And in fact, the St. Lucie estuary region has twice the national rate of death due to non-alcoholic liver disease, and it's highly correlated to these discharges of a toxic algae from Lake Okeechobee. So one question that I think the public should engage the Corps with at whatever they're talking about, if they could be talking about the Lake Okeechobee impacts and how they're going to try to create a healthy lake, the public should ask, well, that's wonderful, that's important, but how is that going to affect the health of the estuarine communities? Mm-hmm. The second, you mentioned, Eve, earlier, the economic impact. These toxic algae discharges, they'll shut down businesses to minimize the public exposure. And so a second question that I'd love to bring to the table is, well, how does the Corps take into account the adverse economic impact of sending polluted lake water to the estuaries? Sanibel Island did an outstandingly detailed study of I think it was a 2018 discharges, and just a 6-month period, there was over about $50 million of impact due to local businesses, due to hotel cancellations, due to fish and tackle, bait and tackle shops having to close down, rental watercraft closing down. So just that one 6-month period had a $50 million impact on just one community. So a second question I think the public ought to be engaging the Corps with is, how do their analyses take into account the adverse economic impact in the estuarine region? And then something that's always on our minds is, how do those operations affect the environments in both estuarine areas as well?
That's a great point. So we're getting a bunch of questions rolling in from Facebook now. And Gary, one of them is for you. The question is, why can't the St. Lucie River get the same water quality restrictions the Everglades get? We have wildlife, I believe, that are being harmed, maybe as much as the seaside sparrow.
Yeah, that's a great question. I asked that myself, and the Everglades has a very highly protected water quality status. They also have, as you mentioned, this Cape Sable seaside sparrow, which the federal government has placed a very high category protection on. However, as the person who asked the question points out, the estuarine communities have its own, I think on the order of 3 dozen or so threatened and endangered species. Rayanne mentioned the small-tooth sawtooth.
Small-tooth sawfish.
Thank you very much. So we do have a series of threatened and endangered species. I think the one difference is that the federal government actually filed legal challenge against the state of Florida for the Everglades water quality, and that has resulted in a very tight and very highly regulated water quality system for water moving into the Everglades. On the other hand, there has not been a similar federal insistence that the state of Florida maintain and regulate the polluters that are allowed to discharge highly polluted water to Lake Okeechobee, as well as polluted water to the estuaries. So the federal government has failed in that regards to monitor the progress of the state. However, let me state right up front, the state of Florida is negligent by not enforcing its own state water quality standards, its own total maximum daily loads to the polluters in the watersheds of Lake Okeechobee, as well as the other estuaries. But the key, I think, is litigation, a very different litigation environment in the Everglades as opposed to the estuaries.
So we're friends of the Everglades here, and we see the Everglades as a vast interconnected system, including right. The estuaries, east, west, and south, and the whole system can't work if others are suffering. So that's why we need a better lake schedule, and we need to move more clean water south and to the Caloosahatchee when it needs it. On the lawsuit note, Rayanne, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know that there was a lawsuit filed pertaining to impacts to endangered species on the Caloosahatchee side of the state. Can you fill us in on that and how that might play a role?
We are not engaged in that lawsuit. I believe that is Center for Biological Diversity and Waterkeeper. The idea there is that the toxic export of a toxic bloom to the Caloosahatchee endangers the critical habitat, and the Caloosahatchee is designated critical habitat for small-tooth sawfish and the manatee, both endangered species. And so you have 2 endangered species, you have critical designated habitat, and then you've got a toxic bloom exported from the lake that basically blankets the surface of the water with a latex-looking crud. That causes a whole cascade of issues that have to do with oxygen and lack of oxygen, lack of light penetration. And then the other aspect of this is you either have too much water flowing down the river or too little water, and think about this personally. If you had to try to live in an environment where the oxygen got really scarce and then it got really toxic, you know, how many of us could survive that? And so in the same way, if you have these extremes that we bounce between, you've got to take them into consideration. During the LORS 08, the current regulation schedule, there was a no effect biological opinion on the small 2 sawfish, but that clearly didn't use some of the more current data that we have on small 2 sawfish to show that they get pushed out to the very edges of their habitat range at the coast. So losing 30 miles or so of suitable habitat if water were managed properly. And then, you know, having problems when too little flow causes blooms as well in the Caloosahatchee itself. So it's a matter of getting the water right for designated species that have critical habitat.
Very good. We're getting some questions rolling in about the sugar industry and its water needs. So I'll put this out to the group, and whomever feels most equipped to answer it can take a stab at it. How many gallons of water per acre is required to grow sugar? When does sugar require the most water? And what kinds of chemicals are needed in sugar farming? Gary, are you equipped to answer that one, or anyone?
Well, not completely. There's probably other sources on the internet or other experts that can talk to that certainly better than I can. They have a growing season. It's a grass, and it in essence grows all year round. During the wet season, traditionally the May to November timeframe, typically rainfall satisfies their water supply. However, during the dry season, they do look to Lake Okeechobee, and as was mentioned earlier, that in general, the higher that they can keep the lake, or the higher that the lake is during this dry season, the greater chances they'll have the water that they need during their growing periods.
Right. Go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah. I can't give you the amount per acre. I can tell you, expanding on what Gary's saying, in the dry season, sugar wants as much water in Lake Okeechobee as it can possibly hold without breaking the dike, because the dry season can get very dry, and that gives them a guarantee of the water they need. If you keep it full until June 1st, then you have to dump 2 feet of Lake Okeechobee on the 2 estuaries to get rid of it, because hurricanes are coming. And so absolutely maximizing their use in the dry season causes problems, because you don't send water south where they need it. You don't send it to the Caloosahatchee where you need it. You send it all to south of the lake. Right now, the great sucking sound you hear of water lowering in Lake Okeechobee is coming from water going to sugarcane fields. They need it in the dry season. In the wet season, the screams you hear from the east and west estuaries is they don't want any water anymore in the Everglades agricultural area, and the lake is being dumped on us because that's the only way you can keep the dike from breaking. So the sugarcane industry, the thing again to look at is not we mustn't pay attention to this or this, but we need peaceful coexistence. We need to have a system where sugar will take some risk along with the rest of us taking a lot of risk. And one of the pluses that has happened and is in the process of quietly happening right now is the Water Management District noticed at a meeting a month or so ago that they have a regular update on future risk of water shortage for water users. But they didn't have any regular update on future risk of dumping toxic algae on the estuaries. They're now proposing to get a system in place where they can tell us what these various balancing of the water levels in the lake do in various different directions, not just in a question of whether they will absolutely supply the water users who want water.
Thanks. And I know you want to jump in, Rayanne, but I just want to remind our audience to ask questions you have in the comments. And also, all of these things are factors in the new Lake Okeechobee Management Plan, LOSM. So everything we're talking about can be improved if that new plan takes into account concerns about public health and water needs that we're discussing. Rayanne, did you want to chime in?
So I just wanted to add that the crop rotation, I think, is a 3-year crop rotation, and any water that comes out of the lake is delivered through canals, the Miami North New River, Hillsborough, and West Palm Beach Canal, that are then sort of additional sources of water for irrigation for sugarcane. The growing of sugarcane, though, has required the dewatering of about 18 inches of soil. That in itself takes an organic soil and exposes it to oxygen. And we know that there have been multiple feet of loss of elevation in those areas that are farmed for sugarcane. As a result, they're compacting and creating a new bowl. So it becomes harder and harder for them to get rid of enough water to dewater and then have enough water. And that's why they've used the lake as a reservoir. So it's sort of a self-perpetuating compounding problem. Very
good. One more question on sugar, and then I want us to dive a little more into the health risks. I'm going to direct this one to you, Maggie, because the question is about the hundreds of millions of dollars the sugar industry spends on lobbyists and elections and political outcomes. And the question is, what's the best way to compete with that in order to create policies that benefit everyone? I think you know a little bit about going up against big, powerful interests.
I'm probably not a good example right now. We had a panel that I was moderator on a year or so ago for the documentary Toxic Puzzle, which everybody should watch and will teach you about cyanobacteria. And we had 3 scientists on the panel, and one of the questions asked at the end was, what's the most important thing we can do? And these were 3 highly technical PhDs who could have told us highly technical answers. I was impressed. Each of them had the same single word answer: vote, vote, vote. Our legislature has done a lousy job in the last 20 years of protecting our water supply and our water management system and making it work for everybody. Don't pick parties, though all of us will in one way or another on other issues. But when you're looking at whether their claims about what they did for water are true or not, go to one of the sites of environmental organizations that tell you how the incumbents have voted, how they've actually voted on the things that hurt, and how they voted on the things that would have helped. Look at those who are running against them, and look at what they've actually done, not what they will claim they have done. But the only way we're going to solve this problem in the long run is to have a legislature that is responsive to the environment and the health of all the people of the state of Florida.
Thanks, Maggie. And Friends of the Everglades is a 501c3. We don't get involved in elections or campaigns, but we have an affiliated nonprofit called bullsugar.org, a 501c4, that is working on a voter guide and digging in right now with a really sharp group of volunteers to examine candidates across the state. So stay tuned on that. Okay, with the time we have left, I want to make sure we talk about the health risks. Toxic Puzzle was a great way to jump into that. Again, if you haven't seen it, please watch this documentary. It's excellent. And Gary alluded to this as well. We have seen a just growing body of evidence that makes it indisputable that cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, the neurotoxins in it are linked to ALS, possibly Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So let's put a finer point on that. And Maggie, I'll kick it to you again. What have you learned about those connections, and how can we translate that new knowledge into a better lake plan?
More than I ever wanted to know. We're getting information from all over the world. Cyanobacteria is a problem all over the world because it's getting warmer and it outcompetes other natural, less fierce algae in warmer weather, because we have more industrial agriculture and they're using more fertilizer in more intense ways, and it's in the runoff to these areas, and also because of reservoirs, because reservoirs that do not have natural vegetation are far more prone to algae blooms. So what I want everybody to know is cyanobacteria is not an unpronounceable word about a mythological beast that some crazed environmentalist invented to scare people. I was appalled to find that the state health department was saying just 2 years ago, there has been no proof of long-term effects. That's not true. If they read any of the research journals at all, they would know for the last 10 years, we've been building a list longer than my arm, and it's a long arm, of research studies that shows it kills 90-pound dogs straight off. It kills sea otters. It kills cows. Luckily, we don't tend to go down and lap up the water in the estuary when it's green, but it can kill you if you breathe it. And it can kill you with long-term exposures that cause liver cancer, that cause diabetes, that cause all sorts of things from moderate exposure over time. We have found that it's taken up by crops, even in moderate levels in the irrigation water supply. We have found that breathing it is much worse than drinking it because you don't digest out some of the toxins. We've discovered that those toxins can be found up to a mile away from the Great Lakes where they were measuring them. And we have found that there are 50 different cyanobacteria in Lake Okeechobee, and the state's only testing for 3 of them. That there are dozens of different toxins, that each of those cyanobacteria do a bunch of different toxins. The one they're testing for is microcystis. That's important. It's the dominant one, but they're not testing for BMAA. BMAA is the one that they have found from independent labs, not from the state of Florida, which wasn't testing for it, exist in the algae that have been blooming in Lake Okeechobee and exist in some of the fish that they've tested from Lake Okeechobee. BMAA is the one that most recently they've done experiments on monkeys that show that if you feed them moderate doses of it, you produce Alzheimer's and you produce ALS. They have studies from longer back showing those that lived around lakes in New Hampshire that had regular blue-green algae blooms had significantly higher rates of ALS, which is an otherwise rare disease. Probably the message for people who are 79 years old like I am is we're not going to die of it because we won't be exposed long enough. But the message about the children that are being exposed over a lifetime and when they're small ought to be terrifying, and we need to be doing something about it.
Thanks. Gary, I keep thinking about a slide that you showed in a presentation I watched of yours that showed the 2018 bloom on Lake Okeechobee and the largest blue-green algae bloom recorded in history on that giant lake. Can you describe that a little bit and then the implications?
Sure, and we're touching around it, but the reason that harmful algae blooms occur on the lake is water pollution in the basins that contribute to the lake. And in the calendar year 2017, Lake Okeechobee received the highest amount of phosphorus pollution in history. The very next summer, 90% of the open water surface of the lake was covered in toxic blue-green algae. That's on July 2nd. The lake was 90% covered. And think about that. That's one of the largest lakes in the country. 90% of the water surface, the open water surface, covered in toxic blue-green algae. And it was during a period where massive lake releases were being made to the St. Lucie estuary, as well as the Caloosahatchee estuary. Photographic document, there was some question, well, gee, the estuaries have their own source of pollution, which is absolutely correct. There's no real proof that the algae came from the lake. Well, it was very easy to put drones up and follow the water as it moved from Lake Okeechobee or just other aerial photographs. Unquestionably, the harmful algae bloom came from Lake Okeechobee, and it created these massive lime green, smelly, toxic conditions. And so even with a good lake operating schedule, the harmful algae blooms are going to continue until, as Maggie points out, the state of Florida, the legislature, enacts some very serious environmental laws to protect the public.
Interesting question from Facebook on this note. Is anyone testing the food grown for cyanobacteria? They might motivate the industry to reduce nutrient loads. Farmers should not want cyanobacteria in their irrigation water. I've read just a little bit about this, enough to be dangerous. I don't think there's real firm evidence that it can be taken up by crops. Do you all know?
Yes, there is firm evidence that it can be taken up by crops.
Scratch what I said.
There is a study that is published in a scientific journal that shows that when you take moderate levels, nothing like the levels we had in the St. Lucie, much lower than that, and you dose cabbages or corn or carrots, that you will get cyanotoxins in the corn and the cabbage and the lettuce, carrots. What it doesn't tell you is how many carrots you'd have to eat over how long a lifetime to have an impact of that. But yes, it is taken up by crops.
Thank you. Rand?
Yeah, I wanted to add to this conversation because I think what you're hearing from both Maggie and Gary is LOSM can manage water to a certain extent, but until we prevent pollution from feeding the algae in the first place, we're only dealing with half a deck. And the DEP is in their triennial review, and we have asked them to set cyanotoxin standards this triennial review, because EPA had set standards of some very restricted standards back in 2016. They just re-established higher standards, less protective standards, and with a very poor study. You have this opportunity when we've had these crises and we have a public health emergency. At the same time, the governor has established very wisely a very competent blue-green algae task force that has laid out everything from pollution sources that have to be addressed to technologies that we can start implementing. So this really becomes this is really sits on the state's plate. This is where we have to put a lot of attention very quickly. And unfortunately, this legislative session, I think we didn't get quite as much as we could have. But there again, we got more than we ever had before. And the year before was really a poor showing. So I think it's important to recognize that you've got to prevent the pollution. We know how to do that. You've got to set standards that are protective. And if you find out they're a little too protective, who have you harmed? Nobody's going to complain that the water's too clean. At least I haven't run into anybody. So, you know, when we're talking about public interest and public health, I think that's, as well as all just the wildlife that.
Quick question from Facebook on the source of pollution. I know you can answer this one, Gary. The question is, what's the source of the phosphorus pollution?
Yeah, the DEP has made it very clear that within the Lake Okeechobee Basin, upwards of 3/4, about 75% of the phosphorus pollution is coming from agriculture. Similarly, over on, at least I can speak to the St. Lucie watershed, you have a very similar proportion. The dominant source of the pollution is agricultural stormwater runoff. And that's not to say there's other sources. There are other sources. In highly urbanized communities, you have leaking wastewater pipes. You have in some areas leaky septic tanks that are perhaps located too close to the waterway on soils that don't really support septic tanks. But by and large, the largest unequivocal source of pollution for the lake and the St. Lucie estuary is agriculture. And I mentioned earlier, even though there are standards, the state of Florida is turning their back on the public and not enforcing those standards.
Maggie.
Yeah, in addition to that, one of the things that the Blue-Green Algae Task Force brought up that I felt was important was we've had stormwater runoff rules for development in Florida for years now. People think they're adequate. They're not. They pointed out that the sheer stormwater runoff, obviously leaky sewer plants are a problem, obviously recirculating that sewage in terms of biosolids and stuff like that, and septic tanks can be a problem, but the runoff from shopping centers, the runoff from lawns, the runoff from new development as well as existing development is not adequately taken care of by our existing stormwater rules. So local government needs to look at how it's dealing with intense development that's increasing the pollution load on the river.
And those rules are 25 years old. We know what's happened on the landscape in the past 25 years. If you don't have 25 to 30% of your landscape that is, once it's impervious, you don't accomplish the efficiencies that you once did. So with the impervious cover, the growth in Florida, we have to be a lot smarter using much better technology, look at the standards for these very flashy events that we're getting more intense rain fall in a short period of time, and then longer periods of drought. And both of those contribute. So the 25-year-old stormwater standards have got to be a priority.
Good. We're running short on time, so I have one more question, and then we're going to end it with your advice to folks watching in terms of how they can most effectively weigh in. So think about that in the back of your mind. But I really want to circle back to this question of water supply for municipal users. There was an op-ed in the Palm Beach Post, I think it was yesterday, about the threat to municipal users during these drier conditions. Let's go around the horn. Is that a legitimate threat when we keep the lake lower? Start with you, Gary.
Well, I'm going to yield my time to Maggie. We've got a short amount of time. Let me let her address that.
Okay.
There were two problems with the op-ed that said that Brian Mast had drained Lake Okeechobee and nobody could wash their hands or drink water anymore because they were threatened with a water shortage. Number one, Brian Mast didn't drain the lake. No one drained the lake. The lake has not been drained during the dry season. A very minimal amount of water has gone to the Caloosahatchee. A very minimal amount of water went down to the water conservation areas, but nobody drained the lake. But the bigger thing is they're claiming that 8 million people depending on the lake are going to have a water shortage because of these lower water levels. The largest water user group in the state of Florida is in Miami-Dade County. They are not connected to Lake Okeechobee by a canal or a waterway. They have well fields there, and those well fields depend on sending clean water south. They depend on sending water to Everglades National Park. They depend on sending water down to Florida Bay in the beginning of the dry season. Having water go down the west side, having water go down Shark Valley, Everglades, is what keeps Dade County's water supply, and that's the biggest bunch of water users in the state of Florida. So those that are complaining are in Palm Beach and Broward County, and they have a group that has joined with Sugar in saying that water supply has to be the main issue. We do not disagree with them that people should not have their drinking water cut off. We do not think that fire engines should not have adequate water pressure, but we think that we can look at ways to ration water rationally while still making the rest of the system balanced without hurting people. And the fact of the matter is, you come back to what I was saying before, L8 is not, L8 is the canal that connects Lake Okeechobee to the east. L8 is not getting any water right now. And Palm Beach is not going to want any water from Lake Okeechobee if it's covered with blue-green algae. So we've all got something in common and we all need to work together on it.
The Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, seems like a good principle for the Army Corps and other water managers to embrace.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I'll just add to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
3/4 of the water in Lake Okeechobee is going to a combination of municipal and agricultural water supply. None of them are experiencing any water cutbacks or shortages or conservation. They're loading all the cutbacks on the littlest user, the Caloosahatchee. You want to save water? You want to put your money where your mouth is. So institute some conservation measures. I don't think the watering restrictions on residential lawns is a very active in Palm Beach County. Certainly the bigger users are where you're going to get the bigger benefit of being able to save more water. And keep in mind that south of the lake, those canals are used as a source of water. So they can load it from the lake into their canals and then pump out of that. Caloosahatchee, Everglades National Park, we don't have backup water supply. And that's the public interest. And this is a public resource. The public resource should be used for the public interest first.
Thank you for adding that. It's very important. So as we wrap up here, first of all, I want to thank you profusely for joining our first clean water conversation and bearing with our technical difficulties at the beginning. And then I'd like you to offer some parting words of wisdom to folks watching as we're observing the Army Corps rework its Lake Okeechobee plan. What can they do? How can they be effective? Gary, we'll start with you.
Yeah, real briefly, stay involved. And, I go back to what I said earlier. 3 questions should be asked at every public meeting. How do these operations affect the human health in the estuaries? How do these operations affect the economy of the estuarine environment? And then how do the operations affect the actual ecological environment of the estuary conditions? Those three questions should be asked at every meeting, because quite honestly, the Corps doesn't have a good track record of considering human health, the economies of the estuary region, and certainly not the environment. So keep those front and center and participate.
Thank you. Rayanne.
So I'd say sign up and stay engaged with the LOSM process. Sign up for action alerts for those organizations like SCCF and others that have put out action alerts, so that you can get a timely notice of an effective message that will be targeted to the right decision maker. Then I would say read widely, listen to all the information, ask questions, but make sure you know that opinions can masquerade as facts. So if you want the facts, be very careful about where you get your information. And then I'd say engage your friends and neighbors in the conversation. In this age of communication, we have way more communicating capacity and technology than we can handle. And so sometimes bringing a personal story and a personal focus in a conversation to something will raise people's awareness and have great domino effect on engagement.
Thank you. Maggie, I know you mentioned voting earlier, but what can we do?
Well, no, what I'd suggest is expanding on what Gary was talking about at the estuary. I'd say to the folks who watch this in the Florida Keys to ask those same questions about the health of the people, the health of the economy, and the health of Florida Bay when they don't get enough water sent south. I'd ask mighty marvelous Dade County to please notice what's happening to their water supply if we don't send water south. And I would ask the people who care about each different part of the system, the environment, the health, the economy that's affected by it, to get involved. And we say get involved in this broad way. Well, you can go to Friends of the Everglades or a number of other sites, and they'll give you a place where you can send an email to the Corps of Engineers about LOSM. You do not have to be an expert. You do not have to write an essay. You can talk about your area that you care about in terms of those three things and say they need to be dealt with.
Great. Thank you. And we will have information about how to contact the Army Corps on our Friends of the Everglades website. Thanks for joining Friends of the Everglades for its first clean water conversation from our virtual outreach offices here at home. Thank you all for joining us from home. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone stays safe out there.
Thank you.